magnetize your minis, flight stands, custom kits, and all the hobby supplies you'll need from themagnetbaron.com.
Hello and welcome to the YouTube channel for Craftworld I'm Brent, and in this video I'm going to be talking about how to score with Craftworld Eldar in the Warhammer 40,000 tabletop game, not the other thing. So this is probably going to be my last video focused on rules-based content, and then until 10th edition drops, probably in June, I'm going to shift to other stuff. I've already mentioned that in other videos. And what I'm going to do here is run through how I've been thinking in these twilight days of 9th edition about maxing out specifically secondary objectives. I'll talk a little bit about primary scoring. I'll also just mention some other tips and tricks that have been working well for me in the late 9th edition meta. But this whole video, I think, is geared mostly towards players who are newer to competitive play, who are trying to master space elves on more competitive tables. You veteran tournament players, maybe there's going to be one or two things in here you hadn't really thought of. I hope so. But I do think that one of the hardest transitions to make as one moves from playing very casual narrative-based games of Warhammer to really thinking about the game tactically in a nuanced way is this emphasis on how to score victory points in what is an asymmetrical war game. One of my favorite things about Warhammer 40,000 is that it is asymmetrical. Not only do both players have different army lists, units that are good at different things, different tools at their disposal, but although half the game is trying to control the same objectives that your opponent is trying to control, those secondary objectives, you and your opponent are selecting and attempting to do different things. I think that that's one of the most nuanced aspects of gameplay. It's one of the parts of the game that I think is the most fun. It's also one of the parts of the game that is hardest to crack for new players. And so I am going to try and help with that in this video. Generally speaking, Craftworld Eldar have a pretty difficult time with the primary objective because we're not durable enough to simply move onto it, sit on it, and score it. And honestly, 9th edition has gotten so incredibly lethal. It's so easy for most armies to destroy enemy units that nobody's really great at this, with few exceptions. Custodies are still pretty decent. Deathwing Terminators, certain chaos builds, but honestly, there are not a whole lot of armies these days that can just move on to an objective, stand on it, and count on still being alive next turn. Incidentally, I think that's going to be different in 10th. Early indications are that there'll be a lot less lethality and that durable units will be even more durable, and I think that's going to seriously change tactics and gameplay, probably in a fun way, because I think it'll be a lot harder to table people. For you new players, tabling means totally wiping out an opponent's units early in gameplay, which is probably good for the game. That said, because Craftworld Eldar don't have a lot of stuff that's really good at playing the primary objective out in the open, we do generally rely on doing serious damage to our opponent's forces such that we can score big in the late game when your opponent isn't going to be able to kill anything that you put on a primary objective. Mostly in this video, I'm going to focus on secondary scoring because, again, a lot of primary scoring is actually wrapped up in other things that you're doing. What are the best ways to move block? What are the best ways to eliminate your opponent's resources? What are the most efficient ways to destroy particular targets? That's actually really how we're scoring, is doing that other stuff. But I will just mention that if you stick a Phoenix Lord between the fins of a wave serpent such that the Phoenix Lord will never be the closest part of an enemy model to any enemy model, your opponent has to destroy the wave serpent and then kill the Phoenix Lord, who is damage gated, so who can't take more than 3 wounds, has OBSEC, and then can potentially resurrect. There's a 50% chance, right, for 1 CP that you can resurrect the Phoenix Lord. So a Phoenix Lord standing on an objective between the fins of a wave serpent is pretty damn good. I wouldn't do it on the second turn of the game when you don't want to just give up the wave serpent and the Phoenix Lord, especially if there isn't a whole lot of other stuff for your opponent's target. But that is a durable combo available to you. You can do it with souped up Wraith Infantry in general, for the most part, especially since chapter approved Wraith Infantry are not really that points efficient. So I wouldn't recommend it. But I will just mention the Avatar of Cain. If you throw Will of Azurian on there, becomes Obsec. And if you throw Fortune on there with that 5-up Feel No Pain, the Avatar is pretty freaking durable. And the ability to throw Obsec on the Avatar is a big deal too. Sometimes too, it's just a matter of putting relatively inexpensive, durable for their points units like Vypers on out of the way objectives that maybe not a whole lot of your opponent's army can target. And if you could do this in a couple of places, one of them may survive. But for the most part, the Phoenix Lord thing and the Avatar thing, those work. But for the most part, you're scoring primaries by brutalizing your opponent's army and then scoring them late. Also, the progressive primary points, the thing that you can do in some missions to pick up other primary points, ends up being really important for Eldar. So if you are a newer player and that seems like one too many things to think about, find room to think about how in various missions there are opportunities to score additional victory points. Sometimes you can get another 10, which is what you need to max out your primaries. That can really make it or break it for Space Elves. The ones that are action-based are really good for armies that have Dire Avengers in them, which all those Hail of Doom lists do, because Dire Avengers can do the action and still shoot. There are a lot of opportunities to be clever with that, but those progressive primaries are also important. But the thing I really want to talk about in this video, because it's something that I can give you a lot more concrete advice about, is how to score big with secondaries. If you already watched my video on Arcs of Omen when it dropped, I went through what I thought the best secondaries were, and that hasn't really changed. The ones that we picked out in that video have been the ones that, for the most part, competitive players are running successfully at top tables. And when you make an army, if you're making an army for tactical, nuanced, competitive play, where you're trying to outmaneuver and outplay your opponent instead of strictly just, enjoying an RPG style story, which is a fun way to play 40K, and I like that too. So I'm not criticizing the way anybody plays the game, but when it comes to more tactical play, where you really are thinking tactically about how you're going to win in army creation, the most important thing to focus on first is how you're going to score these points. How am I going to max out my primaries? How am I going to max out my secondaries? Exactly what secondaries am I going to play? And what do those different secondaries play like in different missions and different maps? And if you're playing, if you know that you're going to go to GW tournaments or ITC tournaments, or you're playing at a friendly local game store, which is, by the way, what FLGS means, new players, if you keep seeing that acronym around, your FLGS, that's your friendly local game store. A lot of friendly local game stores use ITC or GW terrain most of the time as sort of the standard option, or maybe it's player placed. But you need to think about what are the different missions, like the different deployment possibilities? What does terrain look like in my meta? And what does that mean for the secondary missions that I'm picking, and how I'm going to score those? And one of the big problems that newer players run into is they focus exclusively on how they're going to kill their opponent's units, or they get really excited about one not very efficient combo. They're just really excited that it's a combo, right? And not enough focus on how they're going to score. The biggest possible, I've said this in other videos, the biggest possible red flag is if you're picking your secondaries when you get to the table and you haven't really thought about it yet. That is death in any kind of serious tactical play. So you've got to have a plan. The ones that I picked out in that earlier video, behind enemy lines, scout the enemy, and warp ritual, I think are a really, really solid foundation. And then there's places where you can switch one of those out. And so I'm going to go through all of those and talk about how to max them out, but also when you might want to pick something else instead of one of these, and how to build and plan for those. Incidentally, the other consideration, after you've thought about scoring, then you can think about target elimination. What sorts of things am I going to see on the table? How am I going to eliminate those efficiently? And this is where your meta, or even the competitive meta, comes in a big way, because what you need to be prepared to deal with on the table will depend on where you're playing, who you're playing. So if you are playing exclusively with your two other friends who play 40K and they only, each of them runs two factions, and you know what they have at home in their miniatures cabinet, right? Then you know what you're going to have to deal with. And if both of those friends are running horde armies, you probably don't need a lot of hard target elimination or tricky ways to get rid of souped up hyper durable terminators or whatever, right? And if you're playing more competitively, knowing what is currently popular at tournaments, what you might have a hard time beating. So I'm building right now with indirect fire in mind, because the Imperial Guard Space Marine Iron Hands Desolator meta is pretty potent right now, and suddenly indirect fire is back, so you've got to think about like what am I going to have in transports, what has to go into reserve, what units do I have to pay to put into deep strike, what can go into deep strike for free. That might affect also how you build. So that's another consideration, and not something we're going to talk much about in this video. Let's dig into secondaries. So behind enemy lines is the one that gives you 3 points if at the end of your turn you have one unit wholly within your opponent's deployment zone, and 4 points if you have at least two. If you have a troops unit back there, by the way, it gets you a CP back. You can get 1 CP back per battle round. So if you're not running Fateful Divergence, which you know your Farseer can get you 1 back, this can be good. I will say the only troops units that are typically doing this, you might be able to deep strike a Ranger unit, or usually it's bringing it out of reserves if you've put it in with Phantasm. Maybe you get it for that, or maybe you run in with a Harlequins unit. But that's a thing. Just don't forget to grab that CP if you score this with a Ranger unit or whatever. So behind enemy lines is a powerful pick because Craftworld Eldar are so very, very fast. What can be tricky about behind enemy lines is if you're never getting into your opponent's backfield with multiple units, or you're only doing it a turn or two. In order to max this out, you need to pull it off every turn of the game, and there are circumstances under which that can be difficult. For one thing, if you don't get first turn. If you do get first turn, you have usually all kinds of options, because if you were running like striking scorpions, first turn of the game, they're going to be able to move and then charge into your opponent's backfield and fight something and do a bunch of damage and then die on your opponent's turn. But they kill something, they move block something, and they get you 3 points for behind enemy lines. Great. There are other things like that. You could do that with a unit of Rangers. You could even do that with a Warwalker, the singleton Warwalker. By the way, I loved Warwalkers at the beginning of 9th. I loved Warwalkers briefly at the very beginning of the summer, and then they were out of fashion for a while. And I have recently come back around to the notion that this unit is awesome. And so this video will also be a little bit of a love letter to Warwalkers. I'm going to talk about some of the fun ways that you can use those for scoring. And then you have all sorts of other fast units that can move in. So if you do get first turn as a Craftworlds player, it's just not hard to make sure that you max out behind enemy lines every turn of the game. But when you're planning, you have to ask yourself always, like, but what if the thing I want to happen doesn't happen? Or what if I'm playing a mission that doesn't allow me to start units in the midfield? There is one, right? So my striking scorpions can't go there. And you don't want your battle plan to hinge on you getting first turn or a particular mission, unless you are going to a tournament, you know what the 2 missions are, and you've tacked to play those. That's fine. But like in general, you've got to be pretty flexible. So here's some cool tricks if you don't get first turn but need to score behind enemy lines that also synergize well with other stuff you're going to need and have, and other scoring tools. And also these are tricks that you can use even if like it's turn 3, but you don't have anything in the mid board. How do you get something into your opponent's backfield turn 1 or some turn of the game when you're doing it from your own backfield? I got into a brief discussion with somebody in the comments of a YouTube video about this who was like, well, I mean, Vypers only go 22 inches, so like that doesn't do it. It's not possible if you don't get first turn unless you. I don't remember what the person said, but I realized that maybe this is not something that people have necessarily thought through. So here are your options. You can, of course, always just quicken something that's already quick. So quicken is a psychic power. It lets you make another move, and it can be an advanced move. And so any of your bikes which have that 16-inch base move and then auto 6-inch advance, so a move of 22 with quicken, have a potential move of 44, and that's really cool. But it's also possible that you're going to need that quicken cast for something else. So for example, a lot of us are moving a psyker on a bike into the middle of the board and casting Warp Ritual. I probably should have talked about Warp Ritual first, given that, and I didn't. Sorry. Whoops. And then quickening, say, that Farseer or maybe even a Warlock back into our own backfield. And so then you don't have quicken available to like send the cheap disposable 45-point Vyper or whatever it is into your opponent's backfield. One workaround for this, here's my first cool tip. If you need to do Warp Ritual, if that's specifically the reason that you don't have quicken available, what you can do is move the unit, move a Warlock into the midfield, have it do Warp Ritual, and then throw quicken on it into your opponent's backfield, such that the Warlock's going to die, but it's getting you, theoretically, you're going to max out Warp Ritual. So it's getting you 4 points for Warp Ritual, and then it's getting you 3 points for behind enemy lines. So you're trading the Warlock, but it's for a 7-point swing. And additionally, if you're feeling saucy, before you quicken the Warlock, you use a Farseer to throw Will of Azurian on it, if and only if your opponent is sitting on a backfield objective without an OBSEC unit. So you can put OBSEC on your Warlock, your singleton Warlock, because remember, Warlock conclaves don't have the character keyword and they don't have core, so you can't but boost them, and and conclaves can't do psychic actions anyway. Multi-model conclaves that don't have the character keyword, but that singleton Warlock can, and if you throw Will of Azurian on it, you can strip your opponent of a backfield objective, which is another 4-point swing. And that's just a super powerful thing to have in your tactical quiver. It's one of the many reasons why I run Will of Azurian in pretty much any list that I play. So that's a badass, super cool trick. It's available to you. If you find yourself tempted to just have 3 Warlocks ready to do this, with the notion that that's going to let you max out behind enemy lines and Warp Ritual, it is worth... I had a list that was on a tear with that build for a little while, right up until you come up against somebody who can take both Abhor the Witch and Assassination, and you have other vulnerable characters in your list. And at that point, it ends up not being a great deal. So I don't like the 3 sacrificial Warlock build. It's a thing you can do. I wouldn't personally recommend it, but having 1 or 2 Warlocks ready to perform that trick can be really powerful. Another really good trick outside of quicken, which is I think the most obvious one, is Fire and Fade. Fire and Fade is 2 points. It lets you move 7 inches to 2 CP. It lets you move 7 inches after shooting in the shooting phase, and there's no rule that prevents you using Fire and Fade on a unit that's already advanced. This means that you could zip out with a Vyper or an MSU unit of Windriders, or even perhaps a singleton Warlock, and have it shoot something because it can make an advance move, and then still fire shuriken catapults which have the assault keyword. If you're running the Vyper, you're not using the heavy weapon if it advances, obviously, unless you're running a Swift Strikers list. And then you throw Fire and Fade on it, and it just moves that extra 7 inches into the opponent's backfield. This can also be a good backup option for lists that can't auto-succeed on Quicken, or in a turn in which you don't have a Fate die to guarantee that Quicken works. If you can get the bike just close enough that it's within casting range of your out of line of sight Warlock with Quicken, but also within 6 inches or so of the opponent's deployment zone, you can create a situation where even if the psychic cast fails, you still can guarantee that you're picking up those points, and that's pretty great. I think that Fire and Fade remains one of the most powerful tools we have available. Now, obviously, if you're using Fire and Fade to do that, you're not firing and fading with your big unit of D cannons on platforms to keep them out of line of sight, but then not get the penalty. So anytime you decide you're going to allocate a resource to one thing, obviously that means you don't have it for something else, and maybe that affects your list building. But when you're building your list, I think first and foremost you want to think about scoring, and then think about what resources you have left to distribute to those target elimination units after the fact. Okay, another option for behind enemy lines. You don't get first turn. You want to do it if you're running the Harlequin patrol that many of us are running. The Troop Master with a foot in the future is super fast, especially in a Twilight Sadith build, because that gives you +2 to consolidate and +2 to pile in. So the Troop Master, if you put it in a Harlequin transport and you put that transport in a ruin with an opaque wall, in tournament play, especially ITC tournament play, the terrain in your deployment zone, the first story of it, just automatically has opaque bottom floor walls, which is just a much more fair way to play the game. So you can have a Harlequin transport basically up against the edge of your deployment zone. The Troop Master jumps out 3 inches forward of the transport. Harlequins can make a advance move and still charge. They have a move characteristic of 8. So, you're jumping out of the transport 3 inches, you're moving 8. And then what a foot in the future does is it gives you an advance of D3 +3. And then when you charge, it's 2d6 +6. And then with the +2 inches to the consolidate and pile in, you can pretty much guarantee that Troop Master can get into your opponent's backfield. And if you've given it Kegarox Rose and you haven't spent money on, or points, on some pivotal roll, there's some powerful ones, but it ends up being pretty points intensive. That's a model that can run in there, kill something, trade itself, and score you behind enemy lines on first turn. Just be careful whenever you're doing this that you don't position whatever it is, the Troop Master, the Vyper, the Windriders, especially if you're doing that thing where you're jumping onto the objective with the Warlock. Watch out for heroic intervention, and ask your opponent before you if there is a character back there, ask, do you have anything that lets you heroically intervene more than 3 inches? Do you have a trick up your sleeve? If I put this here, can Gilliman heroically intervene and kill it? Your opponent should tell you. Don't be shy about throwing away a Troop Master to score 3 points and to kill something of approximately equal value. Most effective Craftworld lists are going to do a fair amount of trading, right? That's kind of how they function. You don't have to use your Troop Master for this. The one time I would be wary of using this build, you have to look at how many characters you're going to give up. So you have characters that are probably not going to die. Bahareth is probably not going to die in most games that you play. Your Farseer Skyrunner is probably not going to die. Most of the time, your Farseer only dies if you're losing the game anyway. Like your opponent's just annihilating you. And so that's one to not worry about. That's like a lose more thing. But you have certain characters that your opponent will probably kill. Your Troop Master's a dead elf. It's not gonna survive the game unless you're really annihilating your opponent. Most Phoenix Lords who aren't Bahareth or maybe Azerman are not going to survive the game. If you have an Autarch, most Autarchs are not going to survive the game. And the Avatar of Cain, durable though that fellow is, probably is going to get killed. If you have suicidal warlocks that are scoring, so you have to make sure you're not like just auto letting your opponent max assassination. Or if you are going to do that, it needs to be a conscious decision, and you need to have other ways to interrupt their scoring. So that's a consideration with the suicidal Troop Master. The other thing that you can do for turn 1 scoring, that fire and fade trick that I mentioned earlier, that also works on Warwalkers. Now a Vyper can do it. I mentioned the Vyper any turn of the game, because the Vyper can be out of line of sight in your backfield, nip out, and then fire and fade in. But specifically on turn 1, a Warwalker can do this. Warwalkers have a pretty good move. They can start 9 inches from your opponent's deployment zone, and you can move them, shoot them. Like you can shoot, and then you can have them. You can spend the points for fire and fade. You could also, of course, just make an advance move to get in, but then, of course, they're not firing their heavy weapons. So I think it's worth thinking about fire and fade. If you're going to do it with a Warwalker too, I like to try to move block something because it's a pretty big base. So if you can get into your opponent's backfield in a way such that like the space between two pieces of terrain where they would have liked to maneuver some large based tank or monster is now blocked by the Warwalker. That's additional value that you're getting for the sacrifice. And it's also worth noting the Warwalkers are, if you're using the 40k app, riddled with bugs though it is to build army lists, it defaults to the Warwalker with shuriken cannons, but if you pull the cannons off, you save 10 points on the Warwalker. A Warwalker with scatter lasers is pretty disposably pointed at 55, which is awesome. So those are turn one tips and tricks. In latter turns of the game, especially turn 5, Bahareth can really help with behind enemy lines. He could be potentially also the second elf you have back there. If you are a second player, moving him into your opponent's backfield on turn 4 can be a particularly potent move if you can put him down such that nothing can charge him and he hasn't been terribly roughed up, because he's wound gated, right? So if he still has more than 3 wounds, you can make it impossible for your opponent to kill him. And then he scores behind enemy lines on turn 4, and then he's guaranteed to score it again on turn 5, when he can also perform Scout the Enemy for 4 points in your opponent's backfield. And that's a pretty damn good trick. And that's yet another reason why I probably should have talked about Warp Ritual and Scout the Enemy before talking about this one. But these are the perils of not always scripting these videos so I can put out more content quicker. Okay, let's talk Scout the Enemy. So behind enemy lines is great. I should say there are situations in which it does not make sense to take behind enemy lines. So the big one, the biggest one, in quadrant deployment. So where it's just a single quarter of the board, right? On a terrain dense board where your opponent is running something that can play a pretty successful passive scoring game and can really lock that back quadrant down, it can be relatively difficult to get in with stuff. So look at the terrain. Make sure that your opponent doesn't have the models to just to screen you out while also kind of just staying out of line of sight. But in the vast majority of matchups, behind enemy lines is a pretty safe pick. Okay, so Scout the Enemy. Let's talk Scout the Enemy. In general, there are 5 categories of secondary missions. There are the psychic ones. There are the spread out and control the board ones. That's behind enemy lines. There are action-based ones. So retrieve battlefield data, raise banners, scout the enemy. So this would be your action-based one. And then the other 2 are killy categories. So if you have behind enemy lines, you already have a board control one, which Craftworlds pretty much always want. And then scout the enemy is a action-based one. And I like the action-based one and the board control one because they don't depend on your opponent really in important ways. The killy ones can be pretty risky. Obviously, there are situations in which you definitely take a killy objective. If your opponent is running a horde army and you just know that you're going to do 120 wounds to all of the demons running at you, or the orcs or whatever, then or your opponent is running knights or something, and to win the game you're going to have to kill them, so you might as well bring it down. But most of the time, those killy options, if your opponent's probably built his or their army to make it difficult to max those out. And something like Wrath of Cain, really good players sometimes choose Wrath of Cain in tournaments, and I think oftentimes Wrath of Cain is often a showboating pick. It's like, I know I'm going to be able to stop my opponent, and so I'm going to add this extra thing that's going to make it a little hard. Someone's going to get really mad and write in the comments like, oh no, like this famous player took it in this matchup against. Yeah, there are matchups like that. I know that, like I think Scott Brody at some point took it against somebody who's really good in a match he wasn't automatically going to win and did well with it. But like most of the time, Wrath is pretty dangerous for the simple reason that your points, your scoring needs are going to start necessitating what kills what. So instead of targeting what I really need to target with my Shining Spears, I have to target something in melee that I know they can kill this round and then they die. Instead of making my shooting as efficient as it can possibly be, I have to do overkill on this one unit with my Dire Avengers to make sure that I've killed something both in shooting and melee. It's just that it can be wrath can absolutely lose you games. And a smart opponent who sees that you've taken it can capitalize on trying to eliminate your melee units, or making you make impossible choices about what you're going to target. It's a super risky one, and even in the hands of very skilled players, it can be tricky. So I am a big fan of leaning into a board control one, an action-based one, and then a psychic one. Okay, Scout the Enemy. Sorry, so many digressions. Scout the Enemy is the Craftworld specific secondary that scores 2 points if you do it in the midfield at least 6 inches from your own deployment zone, and then 4 points if you can do it in your opponent's backfield. And on a lot of and if you do it with Rangers, you score it at the end of your turn. And then if you do it with anything else, and anything can do it, but if you do it with anything else, you score it at in your next command phase. So on many maps, this is an automatic worst case scenario 10 points, right? Because you can deploy some Rangers just totally out of line of sight in some remote area of the board, and they can just keep their heads down and do this every turn. And even if you never get into your opponent's backfield, it's just an easy 10 points. Now, I'll point out that if you can guarantee that you can put up 2 banners on 2 objectives pretty close to your deployment zone with raised banners is also an automatic 10 points if you know that you can hold on to them for the entirety of the game. And if you're looking at like, which one do I take, it's important to point out that for banners, because unlike with other action-based stuff, you can perform the raise banners action any number of times in a single turn. So with banners, you just perform the action once, and then it's done, and you don't have to think about it until you're grabbing other objectives later in the game in the middle of the board of your opponent's backfield. So all things being equal, if there's no way for you to score behind enemy lines in your opponent's backfield, that those 10 passive points might be better used on banners if your opponent doesn't have a list that's going to high pressure you. At the end of this little bit, I'll talk a little bit more about how to know whether to choose banners or behind enemy lines. But generally with behind enemy lines, you want to plan to do some scoring in your opponent's backfield. I already mentioned in an earlier video that one option is, after you deploy, you use Phantasm to pick up a unit of Rangers, or maybe multiple units of Rangers. And because of the way Phantasm is phrased, you can, I know people get upset about this, but Phantasm is phrased such that it happens after the first battle round has begun, and the rule in Arcs of Omen that causes reinforcements to be destroyed at the end of the third battle round only applies to reinforcements that went into reserve before the first battle round. And the whole reason why there are rules for where reserves can come in on turn 4 and turn 5 is that there are tricky ways to bring them in, and this is one of them. So it is possible for you to put a couple of units of Rangers into reserve with Phantasm, and then drop them in your opponent's backfield on turn 4 or even 5, one of them, to then auto succeed on this and score 4 points. Now, a lot of the time, savvy opponents will not make it possible for you to do, unless you've pretty much tabled your opponent, in which case you don't really need the Rangers to do it because you can get something else into the backfield and do it. Savvy opponents will screen you out of being able to deploy the Rangers into the backfield and pull this off, especially on boards that have deployment zones such that your opponent doesn't really need to spread out too much to screen. Also, you can't come in within 6 inches of your opponent's table edge, so those like really long boards with the really shallow deployment zone, it can be pretty hard on those to make use of that. But that is a trick. I already mentioned when I was talking about behind enemy lines with Scout the Enemy, the Baharath trick, where you jump into your opponent's backfield on turn 4. If you're player 2, your opponent has a turn to shoot him, but it's not enough to kill him because he's wound gated, and then he performs behind enemy lines on turn 5 and scores you yet another. I'm sorry, he performs Scout the Enemy on turn 5 and scores yet another 3 points for behind enemy lines. Another option, if your opponent, if it is that long deployment where the table is, you're looking at each other over the map such that there's the least possible distance between you. oftentimes, because craft worlds are so fast, you can focus on, from the beginning of the game, you can build your army list such and plan such that you're planning to control an area of the board. A big part of 40K, a big part of winning at 40K, especially slightly more tactically complex games, is picking parts of the board and gaining control of them, especially as a Craft Worlds player, because our units are so fragile. There have to be places on the board from which you can operate with safety. And we have a lot of stuff to help us do that. So Howling Banshees, Shining Spears that can just charge into a part of the opponent's backfield. If you move up something like your D cannons on one side of the board, you just put overwhelming pressure on part of your opponent's backfield. By the way, you're going to need to pressure multiple spots in your opponent's backfield, so they can't just switch resources to compensate for the fact that you're doing this. But you may be able to carve out like a safe space in your opponent's backfield, and this is only going to work on boards where your opponent's deployment zone is not all visible from every part of itself, if you see what I'm saying. So if in a situation where your entire opponent's deployment zone is basically line of sight from everywhere else in your opponent's deployment zone, then you're not going to be able to like gain control of part of it without being subject to fire by basically their entire army. But on maps where you can pick a part of your opponent's deployment zone that's out of line of sight from the rest of your opponent's deployment zone and put overwhelming fire on it and screen it from powerful melee threats with something like a cheap Vyper or a Warwalker or some Rangers, you could potentially get like a beachhead, which will get you behind enemy lines and scout the enemy every turn of the game. I think this is especially important to do for like Yanari lists or vengeful lists that lean into melee in a big way, because you need like a staging ground also for those late game melee moves. And also keep in mind, scout the enemy. Like your Wave Serpent that had a couple units of Howling Banshees in it, you can stick it mostly out of line of sight where maybe it takes some fire from your opponent, but you know that it won't be destroyed, and it can do behind enemy lines in the midfield, or maybe even in your opponent's backfield, or some Vyper that's really quick that moves 16 inches out of line of sight in the midfield and performs behind enemy lines. Don't assume that you need a bunch of units of Rangers to do this. I basically already said that, but people forget about this. There are times, however, when behind enemy lines is a terrible trap. For example, if you have looked at the official GW layouts for the Arcs of Omen tournament season, one of them is one of the layouts from last fall, and the other one is new and different. And that second one, Table 3, I think it's called, or whatever the second one is, it's a lot of terrain on the table, and if you were to not know anything about the game really and walk up to the table and look at it, you'd think, wow, there's so much terrain. But actually, the ruins are so freaking big that anything in the midfield, I mean like even a little bit in the midfield, when you're in quadrant deployment specifically, is basically out in the open. And that is not a board for behind enemy lines. Because your Rangers will die fast, and then anything else, as soon as it starts performing behind enemy lines, you've incentivized a savvy opponent destroying it to stop you getting 3 points, and there isn't a whole lot in your army that your opponent can't kill if they're really motivated to do so. The matches I mentioned, there are going to be matches in which you want to take banners, and I think the deciding factor, if your opponent's army is slow and they don't have a whole lot of stuff that can start in deep strike, and you know that they're just not going to be able to contest at least 2 objectives in your backfield or on your side of the table, really. And keep in mind that in order to pull your banners down, they have to actually take control of it. Shooting you off it is not enough. The banner will stay there. So if you know that you can put up 2 banners on turn 1 that are still going to be there at the end of the game because your opponent is running Death Guard or something, do it. Take that one. And then in the late game, because banners scores not only in your command phase but also at the end of the game, if you are even on like turn 5, if you are messing up your opponent in the late game, as Craft Worlds usually do, and throwing up some extra banners, even if they're only scoring on turn 5, you can pretty easily in those matchups with banners get to 12, 13. If you really mess your opponent up, 15. And so that I think is a solid play. Okay, Warp Ritual. So there are two psychic options. One is Warp Ritual and one is Psychic Interrogation. Psychic Interrogation used to be the go-to pick until it required line of sight. Now, the way it's phrased, it's worth pointing out, Psychic Interrogation, you don't actually need line of sight to the target. This is kind of stupid. There has to be a character that you can see and a character within range. Now, this is also just obviously a mistake in phrasing, so I never do this, but those of you who play rules as written, it is true that you can target a character out of line of sight as long as you can see one anywhere on the board, the way the phrasing is. There are going to be times when Psychic Interrogation makes sense, because you can get to 15 with Psychic Interrogation. You can't get there with Warp Ritual. But of course, to get to 15 with Psychic Interrogation, you have to do it every single turn of the game, which means in order for the elf doing it to cast any powers at all, it has to be a Farseer, and it has to be using a 1 CP stratagem to then only do one cast. Whereas Warp Ritual, you pull it off 3 times, you max it out at 12. If you know you can get to 15 with Psychic Interrogation and you're in a tournament, you're trying to score as high as you possibly can in your games, that's the one you pick. If you're just trying to win the game that you're playing, Warp Ritual is usually a better pick. It's much easier to pull off, far less can go wrong, and it's much less resource intensive. So the most obvious way to score Warp Ritual is to move a Psyker on a jet bike into the middle of the board, to do the action, and I already mentioned this, have another Psyker cast Quicken on the Psyker of the jet bike and just get him out of there. New players, you don't need to control the middle of the board, right? It's 6 inches from the center point. So even if there is like an objective in the middle of the board and your opponent has models all over it, you can still move your opponent, because it's like a 12-inch bubble essentially there. You can still move a Psyker in, do the Warp Ritual, run away. Where Warp Ritual gets a little bit hairy is when your opponent has pretty powerful denial. And I do think Warp Ritual can still be a really good pick against armies with good denial to a point. But you need some kind of casting bonus. So if you're running Ulthway, that's pretty good because you get +1 to your first test, which includes performing Psychic Ritual. Even if your opponent has Psykers who can deny, you only need to succeed 3 times. And so if you're getting a +1 and maybe you have a reroll in your back pocket, that's pretty safe. If you're running the secondary objective or the Craftworld trait, Children of Prophecy, which I freaking love, that lets you reroll all 1s and 2s for psychic tests, which includes both Ritual and also Psychic Denial, I think, for Children of Prophecy, which is really, really good. That's probably enough to beat it too. If you're not running something with an inherent bonus, you probably want Focus Will in your list in case you come up against an opponent with Deny, because Focus Will, if you have a Footseer with Focus Will and you move a regular Farseer on a jet bike into the middle of the board and you throw Focus Will on your Farseer in the middle of the board, now you're casting on +2, you perform Warp Ritual, and then you can spend another CP for your Farseer in the middle of the board to also just cast and then run away. I really, really like that middle board Farseer. I love to throw something on him like Doom or even Executioner, because he's close enough to your opponent's army that he's going to be able to put those things on a choice target and then run away. So that is nice synergy with being the elf in the middle of the board that performs the ritual. The one time Warp Ritual might not be a really good pick is if you come up against an army with a fair amount of 4-up auto deny. So there are armies that have units that just auto deny on a 4-up. On a 5-up, I don't really worry about it because you've only got to pull it off 3 times. And by the late game, you may have killed the units with the auto deny anyway. But if your opponent just has some 4-up auto deny units that you know you can't kill within the first two turns, then maybe you really do need to look at another option. But in the vast majority of matchups, Warp Ritual is really, really good. So you should be able to get to... Oh, one more thing about Warp Ritual. Don't feel... So you have to perform it 3 times to pull it off. Those don't have to be the first 3 turns of the game. Okay? In fact, it makes a lot of sense often to not attempt Warp Ritual either on turn 1 or turn 2 if your opponent doesn't have a lot of deny. If your opponent has a lot of deny, you have to attempt it every turn of the game just for statistical reasons. But if you come up against an army that has like no denial, then there's no hurry. You're going to succeed on those casts. And so if you need your psychers to be doing something else, or instead of using quicken to put a psyker in the middle of the board and then quicken it into your own backfield, you use quicken to get your Windriders into your opponent's backfield on turn 1 without having to spend 2 CP on fire and fade, like that, do that. If your opponent can't prevent Warp Ritual, there's just no urgency. It's fine to wait. But if there's denial, or if you're running a list such that you could just fail at the casts, I mean, it's really easy. I think it's like a 5 to cast Warp Ritual, but you could fail that even with a reroll if you're not running Ulthway or Children of Prophecy or Seer Council. Generally doesn't work for Warp Ritual because the Warlock Conclave has to be near the Farseer in order for the Farseer to get the bonus, and that's obviously not happening in the middle of the board unless you're just going to leave, because you can't quicken them both out of there unless you're just leaving one of the units, or unless you've taken control of the middle of the board and your opponent can't stop you from controlling it because you've already annihilated all of your opponent's threats, and at that point you've won the game anyway, so it's not a thing to plan for. So the math here ends up being you're going to get to 15 on behind enemy lines, you're going to get to 12 on Warp Ritual, and then scout the enemy. Worst case scenario, or banners, whichever you're taking, is getting you to 10, and then that's if things do not go well. Really, you want to be getting to pretty close to 15 on scout the enemy because you're already giving up 3 points on Warp Ritual, and as an Eldar player, you need to be scoring an absolute minimum, I think, of 38 on secondaries. And really, you want to be somewhere like 42 because the primaries can be so hairy. If you control 2 primary objectives every turn of the game for the primaries, right? And in matchups where 2 gets you 8, which is going to be most of them, you're going to get to 32 base, and then if you're picking up another 10 on the progressive primary, that gets you to 42. Ideally, you also need to control more than your opponent, hopefully at least on the last turn of the game, either because you're second player, and it's really easy to do when you're second player because you score them at the end of the battle round, and so you throw Will of Azurian on something, and you jump onto an objective, and you steal 3. So that can help you get there. Or you're first player, but you've pretty much tabled your opponent, because Eldar, especially right now, with all the Hail of Doom lists out there and the aggressive melee lists and the Inari lists, like Eldar are a highly aggressive play style that generally win by pretty much annihilating their opponent. But you also have to play the mission. You also have to play the mission along the way. And that's one of the things that I think makes Space Elves so fun and dynamic, is that they're fast, they're hard hitting, they're fragile, they're unforgiving, they're tricksy. You play to eliminate your opponent, but you also have to play the mission, because we don't have these secondaries that just give us points. Some armies out there right now have just really powerful, unique secondary picks that are virtually guaranteed to let them max out their secondaries without really even thinking about it, and that's not where we are. But that's part of what's fun about Space Elves, is that they're intellectually labor intensive. Okay, and as I'm closing here, I want to talk about just a couple of other tricks that have been working well for me in late 9th. So some that don't necessarily fit into the scoring thing really, but I want to talk about them anyway. So one thing that's super cool, I mentioned Warwalkers earlier. One of the really difficult things going on in the meta right now is there are certain armies that have really powerful Alpha Strike, because they can make these pre-game moves with these really fast units that get into your backfield on turn 1, can get a beat on pretty much anything and really mess up your army. So like Dark Angels lists running some Talon Masters, the like Raven Wing, Dark Angel, Speed Angels. They can really mess elves up on turn 1. That's a concern. And then Leagues of Votan, they've got like a 50% win rate, but if you look at it based on whether or not they go first, they win a lot when they go first, and they lose a lot when they don't. And part of it is because they have these really hard-hitting bikes that can move before the game starts and then move on turn 1. So if they get first turn, they're basically in your backfield with these bikes, lighting you up on turn 1. So if you can screen the midfield with units with advanced positions such that your opponent cannot make pre-game moves into the midfield, it's hugely valuable. Rangers obviously help with this, but Warwalkers are so good because they're so cheap. They're a little bit durable. You can, with a unit of Rangers and a couple of Warwalkers, you can spread out and set it up such that your opponent can't make any pre-game moves into the midfield. And incidentally, if your opponent has units with advanced positions in their list, when you're deploy your stuff with advanced positions first, so you can block out your opponent's units with advanced positions, because they can't come down within 9 inches of a unit, and you can't finish one of those pre-game moves within 9 inches of an enemy unit. So you can use Warwalkers and, yes, Rangers and Scouts too, but Warwalkers to screen the midfield. Because walkers are so cheap, I already mentioned that trick where you put them 9 inches from your opponent's deployment zone and they just walk in on turn 1, move block something, score behind enemy lines. That move blocking or just tying something up in melee. Your Warwalker is durable enough that it's not necessarily going to be vulnerable to most stuff in melee. So if you can just start 9 inches from your opponent's deployment zone and move in there with those long legs and big steps, and then charge something like a pretty powerful tank or an indirect fire unit, that really sucks for your opponent, especially if they don't have a fallback and shoot stratagem or power. Warwalkers are mind-bogglingly disposably cheap. And so there are all kinds of fun scoring and board manipulation tricks. I also think that because they're not very points intensive, it's pretty forgiving if you mess up and lose one. They're a really good unit for new players to experiment with these slightly more advanced tactics of like using disposable units to move, block, and tie things up in melee. And if you don't get first turn, you can pick them up with Phantasm, but you're deploying them in the midfield also prevents your opponent from deploying stuff into the midfield. And sometimes it's worth just leaving them and not picking them up with Phantasm if your opponent gets first turn, in order to prevent them from moving in with like their squat bikes or whatever. One thing though, if you are deploying units to the middle of the board before the game begins, check to see whether the mission or your opponent has some way of scoring victory points for killing something on an objective. And if they do not put your Warwalkers or your Scouts or whatever, do not put them on objectives on first turn of the game if your opponent can score by killing something on an objective. Okay, don't do that. All right. The other trick that I really like right now, Shroud Runners. So Shroud Runners have this wire weave grenade stratagem. I should also have mentioned for behind enemy lines, right? Because they can make a pre-game move. You can also get in there with your Shroud Runners without using any CP or quicken or anything if you get first turn. But then they also auto die their 90 points. You can have the move block, and they can also use the stratagem to do mortal wounds on your opponent's turn. So it's not terrible. I tend to be kind of precious with my Shroud Runners and not want to use them in that way, but lots of people do. But there's this other trick you can pull with Shroud Runners. So the wire weave grenade stratagem for 1 CP lets you at the either beginning of your opponent's charge phase or movement phase do D3 damage to a unit and also subtract that many points from its movement characteristic and also from any of its charge rolls. If you also throw restrain on that same unit, sometimes you can, because that halves its movement characteristic, sometimes you can shut down its move pretty much entirely. This is especially good. Like right now, there are a lot of Deathwing Terminators in the meta. Deathwing Terminators are really hard to kill, but they're also really slow. So a big unit of Deathwing Terminators, if you throw the wire weave grenades on it and you restrain it, you can reduce their movement characteristic to 0 and just kind of play around them while you kill all of your opponent's other stuff. And they get stuck. They can't charge anything. They can't get on objectives. They can't get where they need to be. And that can just be so satisfying and also kind of funny, and so elfy. I love it. So don't forget about the wire weave grenade restrain combo. The last trick I have for you. Sometimes people forget that restrain shuts down actions. So if you're running multiple warlocks with quicken and restrain, which a lot of lists are right now, I really like it. If your opponent has some unit that's like hiding out of line of sight in their backfield, performing some action like, I don't know, march from a crag or something that gets them 4 victory points, and they think there's nothing you can do about it, and they've built the list around the idea that you can't prevent this. So march from a crag, not that ultramarines are like a problem right now, but it's this ultramarine secondary where they perform it on an objective, each objective once. They have to survive till your command phase, their next command phase, but they get 4 points for doing it, and they can generally do it in pretty safe spaces. But you can just move one of your warlocks with quicken restrain within 18 inches of that unit doing that thing. And there are lots of, it's not like this only works if you're playing into ultramarines, because there are a lot of armies that have action-based secondary scoring options that they have to survive to do. Restrain, in addition to shutting down movement, causes actions to auto-fail. And if your opponent's battle plan requires them to pull this off every turn of the game, interrupting it even once can win you the game. Interrupting it twice can be devastating. And so you can move your warlock within 18 inches, restrain, and then quicken it out of there. This is yet another reason to have 2 warlocks with quicken restrain. It's a very powerful combo. Okay, so that's what I've got. Those are my last tips for scoring and playing in the late 9th edition meta. My next video is going to be about some other aspect of the game, and that's I think what I'm going to stick with until we get to 10th ed, and then we'll do some interviews with top players and a rundown of all the data cards, and I'll do all the same things for the re-release in 10th ed that I did for 9th, and all the other things that I promised that I would do in that video on what 10th ed means for this content. If there is particular non-rules-based content that you would like to see, feel free to say so in the comments below. I definitely have my own ideas. If you have your own tips for late 9th edition tactical play, feel free to leave those in the comments below. Also, if you have not already clicked like and subscribe, please do those things, and please leave a comment, even if you're just helping my algorithm. It makes a big difference. Also, I really appreciate the engagement. I am a material girl living in a material world, and I just appreciate seeing that people are engaged enough to say hello. It makes me want to make more videos. A special shout out to my patrons. If you're interested in obtaining early access to content and hanging out with all of us on Discord and being able to do roster reviews and just being part of the conversation, it's a really nice group of people, and you get access to the Discord at the lowest level of patron support, which is only $3 a month. I always appreciate the higher levels too, but I try to make all of the most important stuff available at the lowest level, because I know that it's not easy for everybody to find the extra money. But I'll link my webpage if you are interested in becoming a patron. I certainly appreciate it in a huge way. I'll be back soon. Until then, best of luck with your pointy ears, and good luck not only in your next campaign, but in your emotional preparation for 10th edition, because it's coming. Take care.